Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the Trump administration's racist focus on the Afghan shooter of two National Guard soldiers in Washington, D.C., one of whom has died, prompting his call to deport all immigrants from the Third World. We'll investigate the CIA-run kill or capture zero units the shooter worked with in Afghanistan and speak with someone who's covered the U.S. war in Afghanistan from its outset after 9/11, Robert Young Pelton, an author, filmmaker, journalist, and explorer. He is the publisher of Dangerous magazine and has had a first-hand perspective on the war on terror from direct contact with the world's most infamous jihadi, rebel, and insurgent groups. His books include The World's Most Dangerous Places, Come Back Alive, Three Worlds Gone Mad, License to Kill, Hired Guns in the War on Terror, and his autobiography, The Adventurist. He is working on a documentary about Jared Kushner's secret deals ahead of the Abraham Accords, which lined his pockets, and has a podcast at YouTube, Come Back Alive. Then, as Trump blames Biden for the tragic shooting in D.C. without taking any responsibility for sending troops there as a political stunt without any mission clarity or strategy, short of inflaming a situation in the hope of a violent outcome, we will look into who is responsible for the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan that brought the shooter and 76,000 Afghan refugees to the U.S. Joining us is Christine Fair, who is a professor in the Security Studies program within Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She previously served as a political officer with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan in Kabul and is the author of Fighting to the End, The Pakistan Army's Way of War, and, in their own words, Understanding Lashkar-e-Taiba, and she speaks and reads Hindi, Urdu, and Punjabi. Then finally, we'll assess the multiple and confusing Trump teams of negotiators trying to make a deal Putin clearly has no interest in unless he gets all of his maximalist demands, as well as the impact of Zelensky's right-hand man Yermak's resignation under a cloud of corruption accusations. Joining us from Kyiv is Tamar, Jacoby, the Kyiv-based director of the Progressive Institute's New Ukraine Project. She was a senior writer and justice editor at Newsweek, and before that, the deputy editor of the New York Times' op-ed page. Now a regular contributor to Forbes.com, she's the author of Displaced, the Ukrainian Refugee Experience, and has an article at the Washington Monthly, 3 Lessons from Trump's Latest Plan for Ukraine. Whatever emerges from the U.S.-Ukrainian talks in Geneva, nothing good is likely to come from this recipe for appeasing Moscow. And before we begin, for over a decade, we have warned that Trump is both a criminal and likely a traitor, not to mention he's mentally unstable, egomaniacal, woefully ignorant, wildly incompetent, insatiably greedy, and corrupt. Now it should be clear to all that his chaotic misrule must be ended as soon as possible, and until that happens, Background Briefing will continue to investigate and expose MAGA criminality and cruelty, but more importantly, explore strategies and popular movements to bring about regime change as quickly as possible to restore democracy and civility and stop the systematic destruction of the United States at home and its standing abroad. To help sustain us with public broadcasting and freedom of the press itself under assault as Trump's billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media, you can make a tax-deductible donation to our nonprofit foundation, the Public Truth Media Foundation, at publictruthmedia.org or at backgroundbriefing.org/donate. And thank you. And joining us now is Robert Young Pelton, an author, filmmaker, journalist, and explorer. He's the publisher of Dangerous magazine and has had first-hand perspective on the war on terror from direct contact with the world's most infamous jihadi, rebel, and insurgent groups. His books include The World's Most Dangerous Places, Come Back Alive, Three Worlds Gone Mad, License to Kill, Hired Guns in the War on Terror, and his autobiography, The Adventurist. And he's working on a documentary about Jared Kushner's secret deals ahead of the Abraham Accords, which lined his pockets. Welcome to Background Briefing, Robert Young Pelton.
Hi, Ian. Always a pleasure.
Well, thanks. And of course, later in the program, we'll be talking about what's going on now in Moscow, where Jared Kushner is with Steve Witkoff, and they're making secret deals with Putin. And of course, as far as Trump and Kushner and Witkoff are concerned, Ukraine costs them money. So But Russia, you can make money if you give Putin what he wants. And that's what these creeps are up to, I'm afraid. But anyway,
Well,
we'll
no secret we live in a transactional government. So,
no. But let's talk about the 29-year-old Afghan Ramanullah Lakanwal, who killed this Army specialist, Sarah Beckstrom from West Virginia, and gravely wounded Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf. His whole story, we're sort of looking into it. And I know you went in to Afghanistan with the first group of CIA and special forces after 9/11, and you were there, for example, when the American Taliban Lind was captured, and in fact, he was in your custody for a while. So your time in Afghanistan goes right back to the beginning. But then later on, you're working for a four-star on the drug problem, and that focus of that was, of course, in Kandahar, which is pretty much where Lakanwal was operating with these zero squads.
mhm.
So take us back to that period because I take it that Lakanwal was recruited when he was 16 by a brother who was a deputy commander of one of these zero units, which are otherwise referred to as death squads.
Yeah, well, remember in the very beginning, there were two operations. One was the military, which was special forces, and then there was also the CIA, and then they sort of split off. But they both hired local Afghans to bulk up their security and attacks. The CIA went down one road where they did, I guess they call them zero units, but they began sort of as sort of trusted people who came in. I write about this in my book, License to Kill. And do you remember Billy Waugh, the world's oldest CIA paramilitary? When they were chasing bin Laden, he had a very, very negative view of these people. He basically called them no good, lying shitheads because they did it for the money. Later on, they cleaned up their act and they used all kinds of ways to determine whether somebody was telling the truth or not. But the sad thing is that they were used as punishers, as death squads. They worked at night mostly. They went in, kicked in doors of compounds, dragged people out. There's lots of reporting on violent events that occurred, and they worked directly under the CIA, so the Special Activities Division. They were supposed to be an Afghan intelligence unit, but they were commanded by the CIA. And this was to provide deniability. So if somebody did get killed, they could say, well, I would talk to the Afghans, we don't know anything about it. But what they found out before Wally Karzai was assassinated was that they were also used as enforcers in the drug business. So when you gave people like Wally Karzai, who was Hamid Karzai's brother, and one could argue the tougher, meaner, smarter one of the two, they found out that he was involved in the drug trade and he was using his CIA trained units as his muscle. And when I was working for McKiernan, the four-star at the time, he asked me, well, could you check into this? And I said, sure. So he came back with all kinds of eyewitness accounts of these guys being used as muscle, right? And he said, what should we do? And I said, well, he's the president's brother. So either you could expose it in the media or you could take him out, which is the sort of the Afghan way. And he was taken out by one of his trusted bodyguards. So they had a colored past. And the saddest thing, and I have to say this because it's very important, the people that fought along the Americans, the Afghans, are some of the most trustworthy, reliable, and actually patriotic people now that they're here. And they all have very sad stories of night after night of violence against their own countrymen. And a lot of them did suffer from mental problems and from PTSD and survivor's guilt, things like that. There was no mechanism to deal with these people if they were traumatized by this incessant use of violence. So, this gentleman, I don't want to comment on his motivations because I don't know, but it would not be unusual that this man suffers from mental problems from years and years of incessant combat.
Well, if he started out at 16 in these zero units doing these kill or capture night raids, he must have seen an awful lot of violence.
Yeah, and remember, these are violence against families because Afghans typically live in family compounds. So I did a lot of time with special forces and raids and with Afghan commandos and with units that were trained to basically bear the brunt of the violence. So they would go in, they would kick in a door, they would drag people out, people get shot, people would run away, they get shot, people get interrogated, dragged away. It's an ugly business because it isn't black and white. When you go into a compound with like 60 to 200 Afghans, they're not all Taliban. There might be a Taliban commander there, or there might be a bomb maker there. But this war on them, and remember, we relied on these people to cover our back. After Trump and Pompeo surrendered to the Taliban, these were the teams that covered the retreat of the Americans in 2021. And people forget that. And they put as many as they could on planes, but some were left behind and some families were left behind. So there's a lot of pressure and tension with these groups.
So back in 2017 to mid 2019, Human Rights Watch reported and documented 14 cases in which the CIA-backed Afghan strike forces committed serious abuses. So it's not as if this is only being discovered now, right? It was uncovered back in real time, was it not?
Yeah, and remember, the goal all the time was to train up enough Afghans to provide security for their own country. So you had basically small groups of Americans training larger groups of Afghans, and these zero units would have sort of the higher quality, of these guys because they were more trusted. Because remember, we had problems with Afghans killing our people inside the camps. So these groups, and I don't want to defend the violence, but what I'm saying is there were thousands of raids in which violence occurred, and so the CIA insists that they were there, that they monitored these people, and the Afghans also say that they were told where to attack, when when to fire, all these type of things. So we see the tip of the iceberg. We don't see the whole story, and these Afghans can tell you stories. I mean, they go on forever.
Right, but it's pretty dysfunctional to be trying to sort of stabilize, save a country from itself when the president, his brother, is the biggest opium dealer in the world. I mean,
Well, this was the dilemma of Afghanistan. We went in to save it, but there wasn't a lot to save. These zero units, there were 10,000 Afghans in these zero units, and there was another 11,000 commandos that worked in the military under special forces. We were supposed to have 100,000, security individuals that were supposed to bring peace and order. But nobody really felt comfortable that the Americans were going to stay around and do things like airstrikes, medevacs, fun things. So people just started stealing things. And again, I'm not going to blame the zero units because they were closely monitored, but they're fighting in a war in which their own relatives are making money and working with the Taliban.
well, it's interesting now, of course, that the Taliban apparently have cut back on opium production, and it's moved into Balochistan, Pakistan, and into Iran.
Yeah,
And
remember the heroin business, the poppy business was never a Taliban thing. It was sort of in the gap. We started it when we went in the 50s and created all these irrigation areas that were supposed to be for wheat and cotton and other things. They ended up supporting vast poppy crops, and most of that poppy goes to Pakistan or Iran. The Taliban came in the mid 90s, and they said they shut it down, but they actually had a drought, which caused most of it to stop. But during the war, the actual members of the Afghan government under Karzai were running drugs. I mean, that was a big business for them, and they had the protection to do it with. I don't think there's any linkage between the zero units and the CIA in the drug business, but serious people were running opium that worked for the Afghan government. So it creates that same dilemma we had in other wars where there's the good and bad are sort of mixed up together.
right, and we always pick the worst kind of leaders to support. I mean, isn't
The
there
ones we can pay.
right? Isn't
That's
there a parallel with Thieu leaving Vietnam with so much gold that the vehicles couldn't move?
Yeah,
And
Laos.
and the same thing with Karzai. He took a plane out full of cash and whatever else he
Mhm.
could grab.
It's the same old story. And the thing is that we got in there. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan before 9/11, and I was there, during most of the events that happened. And what I saw was a constant attempt to do something that was physically impossible, but was mandated by this American sense of fixing Afghanistan so the Taliban wouldn't come back. And the Taliban never left. They were always there as sort of the other alternative. And it was extremely common for people to have joint allegiance, where if the Taliban pay me to do this, I'll do that. And if the Americans pay me to do that, I'll do that.
So, what do you think? Is there any way to figure out what went on with Ramanullah Lakanwal, who drove all the way across the country from Washington State to the capital and then ambushed and killed these two West Virginia National
Well,
Guards?
I'll tell you some sad stories, because Afghans are like Americans. They believe in personal freedoms, guns, pickup trucks, you name it. They would fit in Texas just fine. And when they worked with the Americans, they saw a way forward. Afghanistan was a very poor, backward country. So when you work with Americans, these people were promised visas. If they served for a year, they would get these special visas. So they became very Americanized. But when they came to America, they were shocked by the culture, in which people would say, "Oh, you must be a terrorist because you're a Muslim." It's like, no, I fought in more battles than most Americans have to defend Americans. And I personally know people that have lost their eyes and been wounded, that open up a bar or do something just to get, settled in, and they're hated on because they must be Talibs or terrorists. And, our president is not helping in this at all. So if this one guy chose to do whatever he did, it doesn't mean that every Afghan is going to jump up and start shooting people. And they went through so much for America, and they were so betrayed. So it's a very sad story, and it shouldn't be handled the way it is, by our government right now.
Well, Trump is closing the door on what he calls third people from the third world. He's just so violently and openly racist about it. And the only people that Trump wants to let into the country are white South Africans. So he's just behaving in a despicable way, and it's absolutely shameful, his response. And of course, he's blaming it all on Biden when he was the guy that made the dirty deal with the Taliban along with Pompeo and Khalilzad, right?
Yeah, and remember, when Pompeo went to Qatar, he brought a letter that essentially surrendered the country to the Taliban, who were not even in power. And this is unthinkable. It's like Roosevelt surrendering to the Nazis or something in England. He handed them the country and freed a bunch of 5,000 prisoners. And there were only 2,500 troops in what used to have 100,000 troops. So all the facilities and all the investment was gone. It was just thrown away. And when Biden was handed this steaming bag of, whatever, he had to deal with only 2,500 troops inside the entire country, and moving out all the families, all the Afghans, all the translators, all the intelligence operatives. We sent in more troops to rescue those 2,500 troops that were on the ground. We sent in 3,000 American troops to pull them out, and it was a mess.
Right. And we were evacuating 76,000 Afghans, right? Must know.
Yeah. But this wasn't Biden's mess. This was handed to him as a predetermined conclusion, right? But when you basically wipe out all the troops in Afghanistan, there will be chaos, there will be violence. And these poor guys in the zero teams tried to defend the bases, but were overwhelmed. They didn't get ammunition, they didn't get air supply, they just fell apart.
Right. So, what do you think then is going to happen in this country with a leader who is the worst reflection of the worst of America, and he's stirring the pot in an incredibly toxic, horrible way. And meanwhile, of course, he's trying to start a war with Venezuela by closing off the airspace. So, do you think that
Well, if you
life?
want my opinion, first of all, that poor girl should never have been there. There's absolutely no reason for uniformed military to be patrolling and picking up trash and weed whacking, and then get murdered. I mean, they're basically presenting a threat to people, right? And shouldn't be doing that. Secondly, we need to hold Trump accountable. It was an illegal act. Judge ruled that you shouldn't be here, and that poor woman died because of Trump. There's a direct connection between Trump trying to show off and this poor woman's death and the other man shooting. So there's that. And then finally, we need to understand that if the individual who does something does not necessarily bring the entire nation or religion or whatever into that same firestorm, right? This guy, I mean, I'm sure we'll hear his story backwards and forwards, but he fought for America in Afghanistan. He wasn't in Taliban. He wasn't a traitor. He wasn't a murderer. He was a guy that was vetted and trusted by many Americans. And we should at least give him that, even if he kind of lost it and went off and murdered somebody.
Well, just in closing, it's pretty clear that Trump, as you've pointed out, Robert, is responsible in a way for the death of Army Specialist Sarah Beckstrom. He's also behaved incredibly in a disgusting way when asked about whether you go to the funeral. He said, "Oh, I haven't really thought about it. But, I won West Virginia by the highest margin in the history of politics." And
Let's
of course,
be honest.
congratulating himself. But he is the commander in chief. And he
Yeah.
sent those troops into Washington, D.C., and he's now sent in an extra 200. And he's given them no direction, no mission, no clarity. So he's responsible.
Yes, and let's be clear about something else. Trump is in the early stages of Alzheimer's or dementia, and it's clear in all the words he says, the action he takes, and he shouldn't be in charge of anything. And so this is what happens when you make dumb decisions, right? This is the exact consequences of using our military the wrong way, as we're seeing in Venezuela as well, where we're wiping out boats with most sophisticated SEAL Team 6, drones, all this kind of stuff. This is a man who's incompetent and making terrible, deadly decisions.
And there's no adults around to stop him. He got this ridiculous character running the Department of Defense, this complete embarrassing buffoon, and his partner running the FBI. You got Russia's girlfriend running our intelligence, along with a complete useless lackey at the CIA. I mean, this is our national security team. I mean, and by the way, there's a whole bunch of them. The reason why we're so screwed up over what to do about Ukraine is there's you got Rubio running one track, you've got Driscoll running another track, you got Jared and Witkoff running another track. It's ridiculous. No
Well,
wonder
okay,
they.
just imagine that Trump's goal at this point is to make as much money and to be the wealthiest man on earth, and everything tracks from that, right? And people say, well, Russia tells him to do this. I think money tells him what to do. If you write him a check, he'll pardon you. If you write him a check, he'll look the other way or flip his political opinions or back your cause. And this is a man who was teetering on bankruptcy when he came into office in 2016, 17, and now is coming out the other side with an offshore empire, and not an American empire, but an offshore empire created by foreign dictators. And that's it. That's his legacy.
Right, and he just pardoned this crooked former president of Honduras who was in the drug trade.
Well, there's a
So,
lesson there. If you take a small boat with 11 people and a few pounds of kilo of cocaine, you get blown up. If you take 400 tons and put it on a ship, you have enough profit there to pay off Trump to pardon you. So there's the lesson to the drug smugglers of the world.
well, Robert Young Pelton, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Always a pleasure, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Robert Young Pelton, an author, filmmaker, journalist, and explorer. He's the publisher of Dangerous Magazine and has had a first-hand perspective on the war on terror from direct contact with the world's most infamous jihadi, rebel, and insurgent groups. His books include The World's Most Dangerous Places, Come Back Alive, Three Worlds Gone Mad, License to Kill, Hired Guns and the War on Terror, and his autobiography, The Adventurist. And he's working on a documentary about Jared Kushner's secret deals ahead of the Abraham Accords, which lined his pockets. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back to look into how Trump is blaming Biden for the tragic shooting in Washington, D.C., without taking any responsibility for sending troops there in the first place, without any mission, clarity, or strategy, short of inflaming a situation in the hope of a violent outcome.
Go straight to hell, boy. go straight to hell, boy. Wanna join in a chorus of the admiration blues when it's Christmas out in Ho Chi Minh City. Kitties say, Papa, 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 Papa Sam, take me home. See me got.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Christine Fair, who is a professor in the Security Studies program within Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She previously served as a political officer with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan in Kabul, and she's the author of Fighting to the End, the Pakistan Army's Way of War, and in their own words, Understanding Lashkar-e-Taiba, and she speaks and reads Hindi, Urdu, and Punjabi. Welcome to Background Briefing, Christine Fair.
Thank you for having me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And Donald Trump, of course, after the shooting of the National Guardsmen in West Virginia, one of whom has already died, the other's in critical condition, made a video and went public and was really quite venomous towards Joe Biden and towards Afghans. And in fact, now he's banning anybody from the third world from entering. So there's collective punishment going on. But as far as I can tell, Trump and Pompeo and Khalilzad are more responsible for the collapse of the U.S. position in Afghanistan than anybody else. And also, in terms of this character, Ramanullah Lakanwal, the shooter in custody now, he was given asylum by the Trump administration this last April. So Trump can't blame it all on Biden, surely.
So I think the fathers, there are two fathers to what happened to Afghanistan. One, as you noted, is Trump. Trump's deal with the Taliban that was signed in February of 2020 really presaged the collapse of the Afghan National Security Forces and Defense and Security Forces. However, Biden did choose to retain Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the chief negotiator on the U.S. side of the so-called Doha Agreement. And by keeping Khalilzad in place, all of us who were watching this were made acutely aware that Biden had intended to follow through with the deal that Trump had negotiated. So when I look at who's responsible for what happened to Afghanistan, I actually hold both presidents, Biden and Trump, responsible.
Well, it seems like given that Khalilzad was working for both, he has to bear a lot of responsibility.
Well, let's remember that Biden chose to keep him, right? He didn't have to keep him.
Right.
Biden made that choice. And as they say, personnel is policy. And so by keeping Zalmay Khalilzad, it was clearly signaled to those of us who were watching this issue that Biden had intended to pursue policy continuity with the Trump administration.
And the people that Khalilzad was negotiating with in Doha, the negotiators for the Taliban, it's never been clear to me that they actually were really in charge. Wasn't there another group in Kandahar that they weren't necessarily negotiating with?
So yeah, so there have been debates about whether or not this particular group of Taliban had the wherewithal to negotiate the agreement. But I think the most important thing was that the agreement itself was deeply flawed. The Taliban never honored any of their commitments. So I don't know why the Trump administration would have thought that the Taliban would adhere to their agreements, one of which was this cessation of violence. Another element of it was the withdrawal of foreign forces. The U.S. had committed to draw down its troops to 8,600 from 12,000 within 135 days if the Taliban kept its commitments. And of course, the Taliban did not keep its commitments. There were counterterrorism assurances. The Taliban promised that Afghanistan wouldn't be a sanctuary for Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State Khorasan province. That commitment was never honored. Intra-Afghan negotiations, those were to start, and they more or less did. At stake was what Trump had agreed to, which was this prisoner exchange of about 5,000 Taliban prisoners in exchange for 1,000 Afghan security forces prisoners. After a lot of wrangling, that prisoner exchange did happen. But these are some of the core elements of that agreement. And the Taliban really never honored any of their commitment, yet the United States to continue to honor its commitment to draw down its forces. And that was done under both Trump, of course, as well as Biden.
But there were only about 2,500 US servicemen left at the time of the collapse, and they had to send in, what, 3,000 more. Didn't they have to rely on these Afghan zero units, the very people that Ramanullah Lakanwal was a part of?
So the biggest issue with the collapse of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces is that the United States was providing combat air support. It was providing medical evacuation. It was actually providing assistance to the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces in offensive operations against the Taliban. With the agreement, the United States could no longer participate directly, and they began withdrawing all of the support facilities upon which the ANDSF were absolutely dependent. A lot of people talk about the troops, but people don't appreciate the extent to which the ANDSF, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, were also dependent upon the amenities provided by U.S. contractors. This is, security contractors. These contractors I don't have the exact number at the tip of my fingers, but they actually exceeded the number of troops that were present in the country. So it wasn't just the troops that the ANDSF were reliant upon. They were also reliant upon these security contractors who were
So,
basically doing all the logistics. They were basically doing most of the support operations for the ANDSF.
so what was the role of these zero units? And I thought they helped protect the evacuation, and 76,000 were evacuated.
Yeah, but actually what happened as a result of this deal was that first of all, they were always CIA. Remember, they were CIA, right? They weren't military. So I don't actually know what happened to their support and their supporting logistical infrastructure as a consequence of this deal. I haven't seen anything written on it, so I can't really speak to that. And so I want to demur on that question.
So, in terms of this Operation Allies Welcome that the shooter in Washington, D.C. was a part of, I mean, obviously, what Trump is doing now is blaming all Afghans for what this man did. And in fact, everybody from the third world, now they're all victims.
Correct.
And he's going
Correct.
after Ilhan Omar and the Somalis. And I mean, it's just the poison is just flowing from this man. But what if,
Well, remember, this was exactly the kind of scenario that Trump was hoping to effectuate when he deployed the National Guards to DC. There was no reason for him to deploy the guards to DC or any other Democratic city for that matter. But he was hoping for some kind of a conflagration, and he got his conflagration. And, to the point that you were making, these Afghans are translators, are Afghan National Army personnel. They pulled Americans out of firefights. They kept Americans alive. Americans repeatedly, American Armed Service Forces personnel repeatedly tried to get their translators out of Afghanistan after the collapse. To paint the Afghan partners in this way is really it's really abhorrent and abominable. And it doesn't represent the views of the American military establishment that worked with their Afghan partners.
So if Trump has gotten what he wanted, which is a conflagration, because he sent those troops in without a mission, without any clarity, and now one's been killed and one's been gravely wounded, what do you think he's going to do? How much is he going to take advantage of this situation? What would his aims be?
Well, you'll recall that he attempted to pause Afghan immigration some months ago, and he got a lot of flack for it from the American military for the reasons that I've already noted. And he relented in that pause. So he's actually getting what he had wanted to do all along, which was pause Afghan immigration. And of course, this is the excuse to widen it to any, I mean, when you say third world, as he has, what he really means is brown immigrants. Let's be really blunt here. He's talking about brown immigrants. So this is part of his white supremacist agenda that he's been allowed to effectuate because of this atrocity.
So you said that earlier, Chris, that the military were able to put pressure on him to stop the deportation of Afghans who'd fought and died and saved American lives. You've got one of Trump's worst appointees as the Department of Defense. He's a complete lackey, and you've got the idiots at the FBI and Russia's girl at DNI and so forth. So the national security team are a bunch of toadies. Is there any way that the military or somebody in the military can weigh in on Trump? Or since Hegseth is certainly not going to do it?
I think because because he shot two National Guards persons, I think it's going to be really hard for anyone to make a credible argument at this point. I think he's going to get his way.
And what will that mean then?
I mean, I don't know what it means. I don't think anyone knows what it means, right? The shooting just took place. The poor woman passed away on Thanksgiving. So I don't really know what it means. And I'm not sure that anyone does know. But it certainly means that, so for example, I do a lot of asylum cases. I don't know what it means for the asylum cases that are already in process. And so I have a case coming up next week, an Afghan case, and I have no idea what the implications are for my case.
So the Afghan community, the 76,000 who came out, they've got to be feeling really vulnerable.
Well, they were already feeling very vulnerable, like all immigrants, because of the ICE raids. But this has really, I would say, heightened their vulnerability.
Right. Well, Trump is sending back Iranian Christians to a country where
Correct.
they are, likely to be brutally treated, if not murdered. And he's doing the same with Russian dissidents being sent back
Correct.
to Russia and
Correct.
to either be put in a gulag by the FSB or killed or sent to the front to the meat grinder. I mean, the cruelty that's going on with this administration, and you've got the Trump whisperer, the dark shadow president, whispering in his ear, who's equally venal. So at the apex of American power, you have a president and a co-president who just seem to be consumed by cruelty.
I mean, the cruelty, definitely seems to be the point. I mean, the issue with the Afghans, first of all, we have to recognize that the Afghans also have PTSD in the same way our soldiers do. Our soldiers are committing suicide every week because of their trauma that they experienced in their deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. Why would we not expect the Afghan soldiers to also have PTSD? They were in the same conflict. They were doing the same things. So, what I find really tragic is that when there's a white male shooter, everyone dilates upon this must be a mental illness, right? This is a mental illness issue. It's not a gun issue. It's not an extremist issue. It's a mental illness issue. But when you have someone like this Afghan shooter, all that matters is his ethnicity, his nationality, his religion. But you don't get the same empathy, if that's the right word, curiosity about motives. It's just assumed that they're inherently bad because of where they're coming from. And these motives are never impugned to white shooters, no matter how many people they murder in cold blood. It's always about mental illness. And at the core of this shooter, I suspect also is mental illness. No one drives from Washington State to Washington, D.C. to shoot two people who is of sober mind. No one does that.
Well, Christine Fair, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Christine Fair, who's a professor in the Security Studies program within Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She previously served as a political officer with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan in Kabul. And she's the author of Fighting to the End, The Pakistan Army's Way of War, and in their own words, Understanding Lashkar-e-Taiba. And she speaks and reads Hindi, Urdu, and Punjabi. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back with an assessment of the multiple and confusing Trump teams of negotiators trying to make a deal Putin clearly has no interest in unless he gets all of his maximalist demands. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now from Kiev is Tamar Jacoby, who is a Kiev-based director of the Progressive Policy Institute's New Ukraine Project. She was a senior writer and justice editor at Newsweek, and before that, the deputy editor of the New York Times' op-ed page, now a regular contributor to Forbes.com. She's the author of Someone Else's House, America's Unfinished Struggle for Integration, and Displaced, the Ukrainian Refugee Experience. And she has an article at the Washington Monthly, 3 Lessons from Trump's Latest Plan for Ukraine. Whatever emerges from U.S.-Ukrainian talks in Geneva, nothing good is likely to come from this recipe for appeasing Moscow. Welcome to Background Briefing, Tamar Jacoby.
Hello, Ian. It's great to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And I tremble at the thought of what Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff talking to Putin and his people about in the Kremlin as we speak. But it does seem that what's going on with Putin is pretty clear, and I'm astounded that Trump doesn't seem to get it after repeated insults from and reversals from Putin with this ridiculous on and off game that they play. Because if Putin can't get the United States to sell out Ukraine and give him an invitation to rebuild his military and then reinvade at his choosing, then he will fight on forever. So he's not interested in making a deal unless it's completely one-sided. And on Thursday, Putin said that his forces would fight on, quote, until the last Ukrainian dies. So how clear is that, Tamar?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I tremble about what's going on in the Kremlin today. I mean, you never know what the Trump team is going to come up with and offer someone. But I also agree with you that Putin is completely unflexible. He wants to basically absorb Ukraine, and he wants to decide the future of NATO, the organization that was created to contain his country and to keep it in check. And he won't settle for anything less than those two things. Now, he might settle for a first bite at the apple now, as long as that deal assured that he could go on the offense again in a couple of years. But that is what he wants. And he is determined. It's like an old Soviet negotiating position. He has his position and it doesn't change. And, Trump or whoever thinks they've made some progress with them, on Wednesday or whatever day it is. And they come back on Thursday and they say, well, as we agreed yesterday. And Putin says, no, I haven't agreed to anything. My demands remain the same and they're not going to change. And it's not, what Trump doesn't seem to understand is there's no splitting the difference over what's at stake here. Either Ukraine is going to exist as a sovereign, independent country that can make its own choices about what kind of economy and politics it has and who its allies are, or it's not. You can't have sort of half of that. You can't be half pregnant. You can't be half sovereign. There is no such thing. And similarly with NATO, NATO is either going to give in to Russia making its decisions for it about what it can and cannot do in the future and how strong it's going to be, or it won't give in to that. And there's no splitting the difference. There can't be sort of half a NATO. So I don't know. I don't know why Trump doesn't see this. Maybe the dollar signs in his eyes are so big, he thinks he's going to make money with Russia, and he doesn't really care about anything else. And it's very worrisome. That's all you
Well,
can
he
say.
obviously doesn't see how different these countries are and who the villain is here and who the victim is, because Russia's turned into a police state and it's a kleptocracy regulated by this absolutely ruthless thug in the Kremlin. And the people are, brainwashed by propaganda and totally pacified, as far as you can tell. And anybody that has any kind of thoughts about decency and morality are either have left the country or are burying their head somewhere and keeping their head down. On the other side, you've got Ukraine, which is a struggling country trying to be a democracy and have the rule of law. So you couldn't have a more different situation in terms of being between black and white, between a ruthless kleptocracy and a striving democracy. But Trump doesn't care, does he?
He doesn't care.
He does
Exactly.
not care about democracy because he's trying to undo democracy here at home in the United States.
Yeah, he doesn't care, and he doesn't. Again, he wants to make money. He thinks Russia is a. I mean, it's both for him. It's always about both sort of pride, self-image kind of, and money. So he wants to be a big. He wants to be the leader of a big, important. The word I think in his mind is great country, dealing with another big, important, great country and making money. And Ukraine is just in the way as far as he's concerned. And he does, as you say, he doesn't care about democracy. He doesn't care what they're trying to do. And he doesn't care about, either he doesn't care about any of our allies in the West, the group of countries that have made the prosperous and orderly world that we all live in and appreciate. He doesn't care about any of that. He doesn't understand what he's undoing. And it's all frightening. And the only, good thing is that maybe, I mean the two sort of saving, the hopes are that Europe will keep saying no to him and helping Ukraine in some way, and Ukraine will keep saying no in some way. That Ukraine will say yes, but no, and in some way they'll get in the way of what he's trying to do, at least in this part of the world, and that Putin will remain the stubborn, determined aggressor that he is, and he'll keep screwing up any hope of something that looks like a compromise. Putin does have to come away with something that looks like a compromise.
So, Tamar, let's talk about the shakeup in Ukraine and the vulnerability, the increasing vulnerability that Zelensky has. And I think Trump is taking advantage of it too by forcing stuff. And as far as we know, Trump and his administration may have been behind the SAPO and investigations. But the long and the short of it is that Zelensky has well, his close friend Yermak and chief of staff runs his office and has been for some time. He was raided, the anti-corruption police, and now he's stepped down, he's resigned. So how is that playing
Yeah,
out?
so I see it a little differently, I think, than you do. I mean, it is potentially a weakness on the world stage. Yermak was a really, fierce negotiator, and he was leading the Ukrainian he was leading the Ukrainian team in the negotiations with the U.S., and he was a powerful figure. But getting rid of him is a triumph for Ukrainian democracy. I mean, he and who knows what really makes Zelensky tick and how honest he is or isn't. But he chose to ally himself with Yermak in his earliest days. They both come out of the entertainment world. Yermak was a lawyer and a producer, TV producer, and they bonded, and they've been really literally just about joined at the hip since Zelensky has been president, to the point that they sleep in these little rooms in the presidential compound, like, with a wall separating them, and they get up in the morning and they go to the gym together. And Zelensky almost never goes anywhere without Yermak, and Yermak really runs the country. Yermak has run the country, took over, between them, they fired all the other capable people, or could put them in jobs where they didn't really matter as much. And Yermak absorbed, assumed, important job after important job, to the point that he really was running the country. As somebody said about him, I'm going to get the quote a little bit wrong, but he was the foreign minister and the defense minister and the justice minister all rolled in one. And and Zelensky really depended on him, but it was too much centralization. And it was arguably, we don't know, there's no proof yet, but it looks like there was a lot of corruption on Yermak's side. And so it's amazing that in a situation like that, where that kind of government has that much power in the middle of a war, first of all, people going into the street to protest, and then institutions that are doing their job of investigation and prosecution can oust a guy like that. It's like, I mean, the analogy, it's like the FBI decided of its own, not the FBI we have in America, but a real FBI, an honest, good FBI, decided to investigate J.D. Vance, and then he had to resign. I mean, that's amazing. It's like, think of of a similar thing in Russia. Think of like the anti-corruption, that protesters would go into the street and say, this is corrupt. We don't want this. We want these institutions to matter and have power. And then those institutions take their power and use it and get rid of the really the second most powerful person in the country, if not the most powerful. That's a triumph of democracy. And Ukrainians are thrilled. Ukrainians are happy and joyous, and it's boosted morale. And, look, Ukrainians know that Ukraine has a long legacy of corruption and there's a lot of problems, but they feel that if the government is fighting it and the people in charge are trying to do better, they feel okay, they know it's a long way to go. But look, the people, my friends and the people in my building, and their sons and fathers and brothers are fighting and dying for the idea of a democratic country. And Zelensky and Yermak were betraying it. And now the society and the institutions that should be enforcing that democracy it's working, and they're winning. I mean, it's incredible. It's wonderful. And the world should recognize that when the corruption gets, it's bad that the corruption exists, but when it gets exposed, that's a good sign. That's like finding out that you have an infection and you're doing something about it. So I'm very pleased by the Yermak ouster. The question now will be, what does Zelensky put in its place? And, can they get through this tough time? Who's going to do the negotiating? And I mean, Trump is the last thing they need at this point. They got the Russians on the Eastern Front, and they got troubles at home that they're trying to deal with valiantly. And then they have Trump, breathing down their necks. So they got a lot of problems at the moment. But getting rid of Yermak, although, challenging in the short term, is a very important thing in the longer term.
So Zelensky's lost his Soratnik, his brother-in-arms, but
Mhm.
the replacement is Umerov, right? The national security advisor.
Well, Umerov is not going to become any kind of Yermak. I
Well, but
mean,
he's going to Washington to negotiate with the White House, and maybe Zelensky will also show up. But on the American side, who the hell's in charge? You got this senile president who's losing his marbles, and you've got his national security advisor and secretary of state trying to be the adult in the room, but then he's undercut by J.D. Vance, whose buddy is Driscoll, and he's doing investigations. And then you got the real estate developers out for money in Moscow as we speak, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. So
it's a mess. It's chaos.
There's too many cooks in the kitchen, right?
But I mean, again, what's going to save us all in the long run is that Putin is going to say no to anything that isn't, the only things Putin would say yes to, the world would be outraged by. And Trump is, again, remember, the money's not the only thing that's important to Trump. Opinion and reputation and the darn Nobel Prize. He's not going to get a Nobel Prize for capitulating to Putin. It's just not. And so the ultimate saving grace is going to be whatever clown show is going on in Washington in the side the Trump administration, that Putin is going to remain reliably uncooperative. So, I mean, things could change, right? I mean, who knows? There are people who are saying that Russia's starting to have enough trouble that by late spring, early summer, it may want a rest. And that'll be dangerous too, but it'll be dangerous in a different kind of way. But for now, I think the good news is that the latest Witkoff offer, dictated by Russia, got exposed as unacceptable to the world, and now Putin is back in the position of being the one to say no, and so we'll go another cycle. If Trump will get ticked at him, and who knows? But I don't see peace. I don't see a bad peace being imposed, next week.
But in your article, Tamar, three lessons from Trump's latest plan for Ukraine, you quote German Chancellor Merz saying wars cannot be ended by great powers over the heads of the affected countries. So, given that sentiment, how are the Europeans, or are they stepping up? I mean, they don't have the intelligence assets that the United States has,
Yeah.
which are vital to the Ukrainians. They don't have the weapon systems, or at least they're delivering stuff from the Americans via Germany and France and UK, etc. But I'm just wondering whether they're the ones that turned the 28-point plan sellout to a 19-point plan. But can they fill the breach?
Not entirely, right? They don't make Patriot interceptors, which Ukraine needs desperately, and they don't have the level of intelligence that the US has been providing. So there are two huge gaps. If the US walks away, it's going to be very hard for Ukraine, no kidding. And if Ukraine decides to go on fighting and the US walks away, it's going to be very hard. But that, they've surprised the world before. The world keeps writing them off, and they've surprised the world before. Europe, my metaphor, it's like rooting for a sports team that, doesn't win for decades. But still you have these hopes that it's going to pull it together. And it's trying and it's trying and it's trying. They're spending a lot more money on defense than they were spending just, 5 years ago. They're all trying to mobilize armies now. They're trying to figure out, I think the hardest is not actually the money or the soldiers. The hardest is figuring out how to cooperate with each other. And they're very challenged doing that. They want to cooperate, but then somehow every time they sit down and try to play nice in the sandbox, one of them gets stubborn and chesty and they can't get to a partnership. And so it's a big challenge, and it's painful to watch because it's literally one step forward, two steps back, every day, every week, every 5 minutes. But they're trying their hearts out, and a lot depends on it. And so, I think we have to I think we have to be realistic. It's not going to suddenly happen perfectly, that's for sure, this cooperation and this power and this defense buildup. But let's hope that they'll can speed it up a little so that they can be adequate. Not adequate for Ukraine in the short term. Without the U.S., there are going to be big holes in the Ukrainian fighting capacity. But still, Europe in the long run, there's going to be more to it, to what they need to do and what they need to step up, the plate they need to step up to than just helping Ukraine. They got to help themselves.
Well, just in closing, it would seem that Putin knows what the vulnerability is. He's exploiting political divisions by funding and helping far-right parties and the AfD in Germany, Le Pen in France, Farage in the UK, and it's not going to be popular amongst NATO countries to have to spend a lot of money, lot more money on defense at the expense of social programs. So there's definitely something that Putin can exploit there, and one can
That's
only.
true. That's true. But I spent some time in Germany recently talking to people about the defense buildup and about conscription, right? About young men having to go and fight. And in the end, I was actually very encouraged by people's sense of responsibility. And no one likes it, but people have a sense that Europe really is at a crossroads and the threat is real. So we'll see. I mean, I think the story, the drama is still unfolding, and we don't know how it's going to go in Europe. But I haven't given up hope, is I guess how I would put it.
Well, Tamar Jacoby, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
My pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
And again, I've been speaking with Tamar Jacoby, who's a Kyiv-based director of the Progressive Policy Institute's New Ukraine Project. She was a senior writer and justice editor at Newsweek, and before that, the deputy editor of the New York Times' op-ed page. She's now a regular contributor to Forbes.com and is the author of Displaced, the Ukrainian Refugee Experience, and has an article at the Washington Monthly, 3 Lessons from Trump's Latest Plan for Ukraine. Whatever emerges from U.S.-Ukrainian talks in Geneva, nothing good is likely to come from this recipe for appeasing Moscow. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.